January 19th, 2025. Somewhere near the roof of Austria, a woman's passion for the mountains would exact the cruelest possible price. By the time the sun climbed over the Grossglockner that morning, rescue teams climbing through brutal cold would discover Kerstin Gurtner's lifeless form just 50 meters shy of the summit, taken by hypothermia, abandoned in hurricane-strength winds by the one man she had placed her complete trust in, her boyfriend and climbing partner, Thomas Plamberger. Before we get into it, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss any upcoming videos. Let me know in the comments which country you're watching from. I love seeing where you're all tuning in from. Thanks so much for the support. Now, let's begin today's case. Kerstin Gurtner came into the world on March 6, 1991 in Salzburg, one of Austria's most storied cities, ringed on every horizon by the jagged teeth of the Alps. For Kerstin, those peaks were never just scenery. They were calling. They shaped how she understood herself and what she lived for. People who spent time with her described a woman who seemed genuinely at peace only when she was out in wild places, especially in winter's sharp embrace. Scroll through her social media, and the picture that emerges is vivid. Hiking through meadows in July, carving down ski slopes, framing a golden alpine dusk with her camera. She was someone the outdoors made whole. At the communications company where she built her career, colleagues knew her as driven but measured when it came to serious adventure. She was not reckless. She was not the type to chase adrenaline without thinking through consequences. The mountains to her demanded respect, preparation, judgment, and honest accounting of one's own limits. Her commitment to physical fitness was documented publicly through her participation in the Wings for Life World Run charity events between 2020 and 2024. At the 2024 Vienna flagship run, she covered approximately 20 kilometers, finishing 2,831st in the global rankings. That is not the resume of a casual weekend walker. That is the performance of someone who took their conditioning seriously, who understood what sustained physical effort required. But here is the detail that would prove most consequential in the months ahead. For all her genuine love of the mountains and her evident fitness, Kerstin had never tackled an alpine high-altitude route of serious length, technical complexity, and elevation. Her experience base, real as it was, lived in the realm of moderate terrain and day hikes. She was devoted to the mountains, but she was not a seasoned alpinist. Thomas Plamberger entered her life through the world of ski events. 36 years old, 3 years older than Kerstin, he was someone who carried real weight in the mountains. By all accounts, his alpine credentials were substantial. Years of high-altitude climbing under his harness, extensive experience on demanding technical routes. He became her gateway to more serious terrain, carefully widening her comfort zone through moderate climbing routes they tackled together. Their shared social media feed painted the portrait of a couple built around outdoor adventure. Photographs of them hiking, rock climbing, rappelling side by side, snowboarding together, recent excursions into Germany. From the outside, they looked like two people perfectly matched by a mutual passion, both steeped in mountain culture, both respectful of what the highlands could do. What the photographs could not capture was the chasm in their respective experience levels. Thomas had years of technical high-altitude climbing behind him. Kerstin's mountain background, however authentic, occupied a fundamentally different category of scope and difficulty. That gap would matter enormously. Austria's highest point, the Grossglockner, rises to 3,798 meters, 12,461 feet above sea level. For anyone serious about Austrian climbing, it is the ultimate objective, a mountain that filters out the unprepared with ruthless efficiency. It demands technical skill, physical reserves, and a mountaineering resume earned through years of progressive challenge. The route Thomas selected for the two of them was the Stuttelgrat, known in English as the Southwest Ridge. This is not a hiking trail dressed up in mountaineering clothing, rated UIAA 3-4. Roughly a 5.4 in American climbing terms. It weaves technical rock climbing together with punishing weather exposure and the thin air that exists above 3,000 meters. In summer, it is a serious undertaking. In winter conditions, the hazards compound exponentially. Their intended line would carry them over the main summit, across the subsidiary peak of Grossglockner, and down toward the Johanneshut on the far side of the mountain. Even for climbers who live in vertical terrain, this was an ambitious day. For someone with Kerstin's background, it represented a quantum leap in both technical demand and overall commitment. The route contains a location that every experienced alpinist learns to treat as a line in the snow, the Frühstücksplatz, translated literally as the breakfast spot, sitting at 3,550 meters elevation. This is the point of no return. Above it, the climbing turns genuinely technical, and retreat transforms from inconvenient to dangerous. Weather that remains manageable on the lower slopes can become lethal above this threshold. It functions less as a landmark and more as a final question the mountain asks of you before letting you deeper in. Investigators and prosecutors would later focus heavily on what Kerstin brought to that mountain. She wore soft snowboard boots, the kind designed for carved descents on groomed runs, not for front-pointing up steep alpine ice. She carried a splitboard rather than standard mountaineering equipment. And most critically, she lacked the emergency bivouac gear that mountaineers treat as non-negotiable insurance, the shelter systems and survival equipment that separate a serious incident from a fatal one when the mountain turns hostile at altitude. Thomas had organized the expedition in its entirety. In the language prosecutors would later use, that made him the responsible guide, the person whose experience and planning put him in a position of duty. That duty encompassed assessing his partner's genuine capabilities, confirming that the gear was adequate for worst-case conditions, and maintaining the judgment to reverse course when circumstances demanded it. Friday, January 18, 2025, began in darkness for Kerstin and Thomas. At 6:45 in the morning, they left the car park near Gluckner House at the base of the Grossglockner, stepping into cold air with the summit somewhere far above them. Prosecutors would later identify this departure time as the first failure in a sequence that would prove catastrophic. Their argument, 6:45 a.m., was 2 full hours later than conditions required for such a demanding winter objective. In alpine climbing, early starts are not about comfort, they are structural to safety. Every hour of usable daylight is a margin, and once darkness falls on technical terrain, that margin evaporates. The early hours of the climb offered no obvious warning signs. By 9:30 that morning, the pair had reached the Strudel hut, moving at a reasonable pace through cold but manageable conditions. Nothing in those first hours suggested what lay ahead. By 1:30 in the afternoon, they arrived at the Frühstücksplatz, the critical turnaround threshold at 3,550 meters. This was the moment the investigation would circle back to again and again. The mountain was no longer merely cold. Wind speeds had climbed to 74 kilometers per hour. The temperature sat at -8 degrees Celsius. Factor in wind chill, and the effective felt temperature approached -20. Every piece of mountaineering wisdom, every guidebook, every instructor who has ever taught alpine judgment says the same thing about those numbers at that altitude. You stop, you turn around, you go back down. Summit ambition does not outrank survival math. They kept climbing. The defense would later state that neither climber was exhausted or in distress at that moment. Prosecutors argued that the decision to push past the turnaround point in deteriorating conditions was the pivot on which Kerstin's fate turned. The afternoon bled into evening. Webcam footage from the nearby Adlersruhe station caught 2 pinprick headlamps climbing high on the mountain face as darkness settled fully around 6 p.m. They were now pressing upward through conditions that would test even veterans of Himalayan expeditions: technical mixed terrain of rock and ice, sub-zero temperatures, driving winds, and zero natural light. At 8:50 that night, the 2 climbers ground to a halt. Kerstin had begun showing the unmistakable signs of severe exhaustion somewhere between 30 and 50 meters beneath the summit cross. They were stranded on an exposed snow ramp, visibility essentially nil, hurricane-force gusts hammering them from every direction. What happened over the next several hours became the most fiercely contested terrain of the entire legal case. At 10:50 p.m., Alpine police monitoring cameras detected 2 lights high on the Grossglockner face. Despite the brutal flying conditions, authorities immediately scrambled the police helicopter Libelle. The crew established visual contact with the figures on the mountain and trained powerful searchlights down onto them. It was a direct offer of acknowledgement, a moment in which a single distress signal could have set a rescue operation into motion. No signal came. The defense would argue that at this juncture, both climbers were still functioning, still feeling capable, still not far from the top, and that no emergency existed at that moment. Prosecutors countered that Kerstin had already collapsed under the weight of exhaustion and advancing hypothermia, and that the failure to signal the helicopter cost her the only realistic chance at survival. The aircraft circled for a time. The crew saw 2 light sources, 2 figures, and no indication of distress. Unable to land in the violence of those winds, but capable of initiating a complex nighttime rescue if summoned, the helicopter eventually banked away and departed. At 12:35 a.m. on January 19th, Alpine police finally got through to Thomas by phone after multiple earlier attempts had failed to connect. The substance of that conversation has never been fully disclosed. What is documented is what Thomas did the moment that call ended. He switched his phone to silent and put it away. For every rescue coordination attempt that followed, he was completely unreachable. The one person on Earth who knew exactly where Kerstin was and exactly what was happening to her, rendered voluntarily inaccessible as her condition became critical. 2 o'clock in the morning. According to the formal prosecution statement, Thomas Plamberger left his girlfriend at that hour, exhausted, hypothermic, disoriented, exposed, approximately 50 meters below the Grossglockner's summit cross. Prosecutors alleged that before walking away, he took none of the basic protective measures that even minimal survival training demands. He did not move her to a position sheltered from the wind. He did not deploy her bivouac sack. He did not use the aluminum emergency blankets that were available to him. He did not even remove her heavy pack and splitboard, leaving her to fight hypothermia while bearing unnecessary weight. At 2:30 a.m., a webcam captured what the evidence had been building toward, a single light beginning its descent toward the far side of the mountain. Thomas was going down. Kerstin stayed behind, alone, on an open slope as winds climbed toward hurricane force. The defense framed this separation as a desperate mutual decision, a plan to get Thomas to lower elevation and communications range fast enough to bring help back up. The prosecution called it abandonment. Thomas placed another emergency call at 3:30 a.m., telling rescue services he had left his partner on the mountain and requesting helicopter extraction. Weather conditions by then had made any aerial response physically impossible. From approximately 2 a.m. until 10:10 on the morning of January 19th, Kerstin Gurtner lay motionless on that exposed slope, 50 meters from a summit she would never stand on. GPS data recovered from her sports watch would later show that she ceased all movement around 4 a.m. and remained completely still for the next 6 hours. She was dying alone in the darkness while the man who had brought her there made his way to safety below. Dawn brought no rescue. A helicopter attempt at 7 a.m. was scrubbed. The hurricane force conditions that had been dangerous the night before had become categorically impossible by morning. The only remaining option was a ground team. The Bergrettung Karls Mountain Rescue Unit began a punishing 5-hour ascent on touring skis, fighting the same conditions that had already claimed Kerstin's life. They reached her at 10:10 a.m. The data from her sports watch was merciless in its precision. 6 hours of total stillness at high altitude without adequate shelter. Medical experts would later testify that at elevation, without proper protection from the elements, hypothermia can escalate to death within 30 minutes. Kerstin Gurtner had died from hypothermia, alone on Austria's highest mountain, 50 meters from a summit she never reached. Her body was recovered from the mountain, setting in motion what would become one of the most contentious mountaineering prosecutions in recent memory. The Innsbruck Public Prosecutor's Office opened a formal investigation that would run for 11 months. Investigators seized both climbers' mobile phones, extracted GPS records, obtained detailed meteorological data, and brought in expert mountaineers to analyze every decision made on that mountain from departure to death. The forensic picture that assembled itself was disturbing in its clarity. Kerstin's sports watch had documented her final hours with clinical detachment. the precise moment she stopped moving, the exact coordinates of her last position, the 6-hour window of absolute stillness before she was found. Webcam footage from the photo webcam network provided the visual spine of the timeline. 2 headlamps ascending together in the late evening darkness, then a single light pulling away alone at 2:30 in the morning. The story existed in GPS coordinates in image pixels, and it was unambiguous. When prosecutors concluded their investigation in December 2025, they had cataloged 9 specific failures they held responsible for Kerstin's death. The first, bringing an inexperienced partner onto this route under winter conditions. The second, departing 2 hours past the safe start window. The third, carrying insufficient emergency bivouac equipment. The fourth, permitting Kerstin to use gear wholly unsuited to technical alpine climbing. The fifth, refusing to turn back at the Frühstücksplatz when conditions had already deteriorated past safe thresholds. The sixth, failing to contact emergency services before nightfall. The seventh, not signaling distress to the helicopter at 10:50 p.m. The eighth, silencing his phone following the midnight call. The ninth, leaving Kerstin without any meaningful protective measures before descending alone. The charge filed against Thomas Plamberger was grossly negligent homicide under Section 81 of the Austrian Criminal Code, a more serious designation than standard negligent homicide, one that requires prosecutors to establish conduct so extraordinarily and conspicuously careless that a clear danger to life was recognizable, and that elementary safety principles were knowingly disregarded. The legal architecture of the prosecution was straightforward. Thomas had designed the expedition, led it, and bore the responsibilities that came with that role. His duty of care toward Kerstin was real, and his cascading failures had resulted directly in her death. Defense attorney Kurt Jelinek challenged the prosecution's framework at every point. His argument, both climbers were equally competent participants who had planned the ascent together. What killed Kerstin was not criminal negligence, but an unforeseeable deterioration in an environment that carries inherent and accepted risk. Her collapse, Jelinek contended, came without warning, suddenly after the helicopter had already gone in circumstances no one could have anticipated. Thomas, his attorney maintained, was not guilty of anything. His since-deleted Instagram tribute, expressing how deeply and painfully he missed her, and his name alongside hers on her parents' obituary suggested a man in genuine grief. The case detonated a fierce debate across the international mountaineering community about where duty of care begins and ends between climbing partners. Willie and Damien Benegas, award-winning IFMGA certified guides, offered some of the most pointed analysis to emerge from that conversation. The real mistakes, they argued, were made the day before the climb, when Thomas decided to take Kerstin up that mountain in winter on that technical route. Their framing cut directly to the heart of the matter. If you carry more experience and fitness than your partner, your obligation is not to lift them to your level. It is to descend to theirs. French guide Frédéric Degoulet described the pattern he saw as painfully familiar, a sequence he had witnessed and read about many times before. One bad decision invites the next. Pride calcifies into stubbornness. Admitting you are wrong feels impossible. By the time you recognize the true scale of what you have done, reversal is no longer available. Commentators drew comparisons to the 2018 Hochkraut avalanche disaster, in which 7 skiers died as a result of a similar chain of compounding poor choices. Adventure magazine observed a deeper structural problem that the Grossglockner case threw into sharp relief. Maritime law mandates that life jackets be carried aboard vessels. Yet on mountains, environments that can kill with equal or greater efficiency, responsibility has historically been governed more by the unwritten codes of climbing culture than by enforceable regulation. Thomas Plamberger's trial is scheduled to begin on February 19, 2026, at Innsbruck Regional Court. A conviction on the charge of grossly negligent homicide carries a maximum sentence of 3 years in prison. Thank you for watching. Your support means so much. If you found this case interesting, make sure to like the video, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss a true crime story. I'd love to hear what you think. So leave a comment below and keeps us motivated to bring you more in-depth stories. See you in the next video.